So our keynote speaker tonight is Corinne Goria. She is a professor at the University of San Diego. Title of our presentation is Sewn Together, Global Storytelling for Social Justice. You can see the key bullet points. She's the author of the book that I just mentioned, and also Voice of Witness 2014, assistant editor of Underground America, Narratives of Undocumented Lives. She writes fiction and socially engaged nonfiction, and she's an adjunct faculty member in the Political Science Department at the University of San Diego and in the Creative Writing Department at San Diego State. And the interviewer this afternoon or this evening is Ms. Sahar Kalantar. She was born and reared in Iran. She was a U.S. asylum seeker in 2015. She got her BA in 2019 from UC San Diego in International Studies and Political Science with a major in Human Rights in the Middle East region. And she, in addition to going to school, she is working as a resettlement case manager for refugees and the Afghan Assistance Program at IRC, the International Rescue Committee. And another reminder that the International Rescue Committee has begun its annual film festival, which is always excellent. And I think it's 4 Thursday evenings and it runs throughout the week. You can look at it at other times. All of their films are always very important films. I can't stress it enough. So please sign up with IRC. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Goria and Sahar Kalantar.
Thank you so much for having us, Christine. It's such an honor to be here. It's an honor to be speaking to the San Diego World Affairs Council. I see some familiar names out there in the Zoom cloud, and it's nice to see you all here. And I'm also very honored to be able to be here tonight in conversation with Sahar Kalantar. Thank you for being here, Sahar. I'm going to pass the proverbial microphone over to you.
Thank you so much, Christine, and thank you so much, Professor Goria. It's an honor to be a part of this event and an honor to get to know your book and the San Diego World Affairs Council. It's really great. Thank you so much for the opportunity. So I wanted to start with a little bit of the background of the book. This is an amazing book, and the book brings an amazing awareness on how narratives can affect the social justice globally. And this book shows perfectly the importance of the storytelling and social activism and how people can raise awareness with their stories. And the book highlights a lot of the stories from people from around the world, Bangladesh, India, China, and also the US. So that's a little bit about the book. So I'm going to start with my first question. I have to say I was really moved by how each one of these individuals and activists in your book talked about their stories without any fears, and some were additionally raising awareness not only domestically, but in many instances internationally. And how can narration also affect social justice movement? So I wanted to ask, what was the original inspiration behind this book, and how were you able to gather all of these stories?
Thank you for the question. And I also was impressed with the narrators' courage in sharing their stories. I will say that that not all of them shared their stories without any fear. And in fact, some of them were very aware of the potential retaliation or repercussions that could come after sharing their stories. But we could talk a little bit more about those challenges later. In most instances, the narrators were able to share their story without that fear. And going to your sort of ultimate question, what was the original inspiration behind the book? It really started with sort of a consumer's curiosity. I was just hoping to sit down and interview people that are making the things that we use every day. a cell phone, a pair of jeans, a laptop, a cup of coffee. I wanted to meet some of those producers personally, sit down and chat. And I think I had that curiosity from the perspective of a consumer. And I also maybe had that curiosity after having worked on the oral history collection, Underground America, in which we interviewed undocumented individuals in the United States. And I had already been practicing immigration law at that point for a while. And so I felt that there were many threads that were all sort of coming together in terms of economics, in terms of the global economy, and how people are sort of woven into it at that point in time. And so that was sort of the original idea for the book. But even that short list of goods, you know, a cup of coffee, a cell phone, a pair of jeans, would have taken me to Zambia, to China, to Mexico, to South Korea, to Guatemala. And at the same time, if we were going to instead bring those producers to, you know, far-flung California, it would be the same type of logistical challenge, a challenge that the publisher didn't have a budget for. So we, you know, in terms of how we connected with people, we ended up really networking with different organizations. And through just looking into some of the industries and the organizations that were working in those industries, I immediately discovered that it wasn't going to be a simple book about how a product is made and how it gets to a consumer's hands 2 continents away. Really just scratching the surface, you could see that in each of these industries, there were, in some cases, decades-long human rights struggles that had been ongoing, surrounding, for example, the mining of copper, or surrounding the mining of metals that ultimately went into cell phones, in human rights and labor rights struggles surrounding the production of denim in Mexico, or garment work in Bangladesh. So it shifted from this sort of consumer's curiosity into really more of an examination or an exploration of the industries, the workers, and the activists who were engaged in the human rights struggles in those industries.
Yes, thank you so much. You're absolutely right. Like, looking at, you know, products, it's very amazing to see how much work and sometimes, you know, like bitterness and the struggle and human rights violation might have gone behind like a lot of like maybe daily products that we use every day. So that's a great perspective to look into things. So what was your biggest challenge in this project?
You know, one of the biggest challenges was that sort of logistical challenge. How were we going to ultimately connect with individuals who were working in these various industries? How would we connect with them in a way that we could interview them in long form? And what we, you know, I say we because I ultimately worked with a team of assistant editors who were based in Hong Kong. One was based in Hong Kong. That was David Hill, who had actually worked on the previous oral history collection as well. He had been in San Francisco and then had relocated to Hong Kong. Connecting with Luipa Mondoka in Zambia, connecting with Gabriel Thompson, who had been working on issues around youth in the tobacco harvest in North Carolina already. So ultimately, one of the biggest challenges was how to connect with narrators on the ground, and the way that that challenge was addressed was to just, you know, stretch out and sort of create a wide net of individuals. And luckily, there was enough interest from both the, you know, assistant editors who were then going out and conducting some of the interviews and transcribing them and editing them. There was enough interest from them, and there was also enough interest from narrators, from the individuals who wanted to speak to, Voice of Witness, which is the organization that put the book out in the beginning. They wanted to amplify their stories. And so it was, the will of the assistant editors and the efforts of the assistant editors, as well as, the will of the narrators who wanted to spend the time to tell their stories. And so that was one of the biggest challenges. I think, one of the other challenges goes back to that sort of introduction about, the retaliation or the potential repercussions that narrators were facing in sharing their stories. And in fact, when David Hill went to mainland China to interview 2 workers from Foxconn who were making iPhones at the time, he was accompanied by Debbie Chan, who is now an academic and researcher, and she's writing constantly about labor rights issues in China. He was accompanied by Debbie Chan, who had been working at the organization SACOM, Scholars Against Corporate Misbehavior. And she herself had a reputation in China for already going to interview workers at various facilities, not just at Foxconn, but at other companies, basically trying to elicit workers' stories to then work on different workers' issues from Hong Kong. So when Debbie and David, got off of the ferry on mainland China, they were immediately followed. They were followed by a dark sedan as they were walking down the street to the restaurant in which they had reserved a private room to interview the 2 workers from Foxconn. And the interview lasted many hours. When they exited the restaurant, the sedan was parked right outside. And as they left to go back to the ferry, the sedan followed them again. And, that was not just sort of a sign that their work was being monitored, and that, Debbie Chan's work specifically was being monitored. But I think it also served to intimidate the workers who were going to give their story and who had just given their story. And in other cases, with Kalpona Akhter, I'm not sure if folks are familiar with her. She's at this point a very well-known garment rights activist from Bangladesh. She was, in the time that I interviewed her, she had just been released from prison. She and her co-workers had been detained on charges that were ultimately dropped related to a garment workers protest. And she had been released from prison. She actually had gone to Los Angeles to speak to workers in a Walmart factory, or I'm sorry, a Walmart warehouse that was connected to the garment work that she was seeing in Bangladesh. And when I first spoke with her in Los Angeles, and she was very, open. And then when we did a follow-up interview, she was back in Bangladesh, she was back in Dhaka. And she spoke to me with, a completely darkened room behind her, and really just the blue screen lighting up her face. And she said that she had to go back into hiding because there were charges that had been brought against her again. And she, in the time between our interviews, she had lost one of her coworkers. He had been tortured and murdered. And they were concerned that it was government national security agents that had abducted him and done that. And so, the first time that we spoke, she felt very free to share with me. And the second time, she was again very candid, but with a sort of shadow of fear that there was retaliation happening against her coworkers, at least. So I would say that would be probably the other challenge, and that's a challenge that the narrators shouldered more than the editors, certainly.
Absolutely. I can't imagine how challenging it can be to just, tell your story, and how much fear it might have been, and how brave people should be. So I wanted to ask you, can you share with us what has changed during COVID, and why did you decide to extend the book into your new edition? I know your new edition is coming soon, and super excited to read that and the extension that you have been adding to that book. Do you believe COVID has prohibited the ability of the narrators to voice their issue?
Yes. Okay. So those are, I'll maybe answer the first question first. So the first edition of Invisible Hands, it came out in 2014. We have been working on a second edition for the last year and a half or so. And really the impetus behind the second edition was that I had been keeping up with some of the narrators' lives and movements and their work. And there were some amazing victories that they had won in the time that had elapsed since the first edition came out. And so, I think that when the opportunity arose to update the book, at that point, we were all in the middle of the pandemic. It was probably the summer of 2020 when I was told that we would have this opportunity to just provide some brief updates. I don't know if what the publisher had in mind was a full second edition at that point, but I sort of jumped at the chance to add some of these victories into the second edition because, for one, they were really sort of groundbreaking successes on the part of the narrators. And, possibly also because we were in pretty dark times then in the summer of 2020. And so the idea of being able to celebrate some of those successes was really appealing. There were sort of some rays of hope. So that was one of the reasons behind wanting to get a second edition out there and to update it with these developments from the narrators. And then, your next question, has COVID affected how narrators can voice their issues? And I would say, as much as it's affected anyone else, it sort of upended life for most people. And so certainly it affected the narrators in that way. I think the other thing though that comes to mind is something that Kalpona actor said when retail stores were closing, that not only affected retail workers, it immediately affected retail workers, but it also affected, thousands of miles away, the people who were making the goods sold in those retail stores. And Kalpona talked about how, those huge economic losses, specifically to the garment industry in Bangladesh, very quickly trickled down to the garment workers themselves. And, she mentions in an interview that she gave in 2020 how, Bangladesh, because of canceled orders from US companies, was, seeing an economic downturn. And what that meant personally was that garment workers were just out of work. And without a proper social safety net, that meant life or death for many people. she said, you know, I'll quote her actually, she said specifically, why do the cancellations of orders due to the pandemic and lost revenue fall on the workers' shoulders? For the companies, it means a reduction in profits, but for the workers, it means they might go hungry. So I think that the pandemic or COVID affected not just narrators' ability to sort of share their stories, but really their ability to provide for their families. And, you know, and I think we've got a little bit of distance now. I'm not sure if it's distance or just perspective that the COVID crisis probably has deepened or widened that gulf between rich and poor in general. And I think Kalpona was sort of trying to highlight that.
Awesome. Yes, that's really certainly interesting to look into how pandemic and COVID has affected the global market and just economy, and mostly the people who are working in most of these countries. So I think my third question is a little bit related to the first and to the challenges, but I wanted to say I was personally moved by the strength of the narrators and how they have decided to raise awareness despite all the danger around doing so. Many asylum seekers, such as myself, are in the situation that they also face persecution due to speaking against some of the issues while in their home countries. But now I have the freedom to speak openly and raise awareness, and I really do commend them for their bravery in doing so while they're still under the condition and they're still at home. So I was wondering, was there any specific story that you were concerned about the safety and the well-being of the narrators more than the others?
Well, yes, I mean, I think Kalpona certainly was one of the narrators who I felt was under threat while I was speaking with her. She had already sort of an established career as a labor rights activist. So she had been accustomed to speaking about these issues. And it was certainly from, you know, from her will in wanting to speak about these issues. But at the same time, I was concerned for her safety. And I think that it's interesting that you bring up Asylum and your own experiences with Asylum, because someone, you know, one's status can affect how one might feel at liberty to express themselves. And certainly, you know, as an immigration lawyer for many years, I think that I see there is a connection between oral history and asylum as well, that each asylum case is ultimately going to start with an individual's ability and sort of bravery in recounting their story, and that story is going to serve as the foundation for their case, for their asylum application. And in many ways, that's I think that is how narratives have sort of developed in Invisible Hands in the book as well, that it might have, you know, started as sort of a recounting of events, but that has led to potentially other articulations of the issue that have ultimately wound their way into courts, not necessarily in immigration court, but in other U.S. courts. And this might be, you know, jumping away from your question a bit. We can come back to it. But so after reading this book, the founder of Voice of Witness, Dave Eggers, he was really struck by one narrative in particular, and that was the narrative of Clive Poraboo. And I'll share a little bit of Clive's narrative because he was a resident of Bougainville, and other former residents of Bougainville later brought a lawsuit against the mining conglomerate Rio Tinto in California in the Ninth Circuit. And so it serves, his narrative serves to sort of make the bridge, not just in between a narrative or an oral history and an ultimate legal action, but also a bridge, you know, geographically between Bougainville and where we are in California. Let me see if I can share a bit of his narrative here. Yes, so this is just a brief excerpt. The Australian government was set to hand over a parcel of land along the shore to Bougainville Copper, and there was resistance immediately. The story I've heard, this is from Clive Poraboo's perspective and voice. The story I've heard is that when the women protested, the police and the company's security forces kicked the women and dragged them along the beach. The way we see it, the company came into Bougainville by force. I grew up seeing our mothers and sisters raped by the squatters, old people getting kicked or punched. When I was a child of 10 or 12, I was walking with a cousin on a section of road down by the river where the squatters had their houses, and we witnessed a group of them, guys in their 20s, assault one of our female relatives. 3 of them pushed her down, took off her clothes, her bra, she was screaming. We were just kids. We couldn't do anything, but she was a big, strong woman, so she put up a good fight with them. Luckily, 2 or 3 other guys came and chased off the attackers. When it happened, you know, we had pain in our hearts and in our minds. Me and the cousin, we said, what can we do? We decided that day that we must try to do something. The rivers were already poisoned by waste from the mine. Fish had disappeared, animals were disappearing, and the company was already tearing up tens of thousands of acres for the mine that used to be reserved for hunting and gardening. Me and one of my cousins, we decided to go into the bush to join the fighters. We said, we'll join the uprising for what we believe and for what we want the island to be. And that was, you know, just an excerpt from Clive's narrative that captures the moment when he ultimately joined the Bougainville Revolutionary Army. But Clive's narrative was, you know, just one of the narratives that made it out of Bougainville. And about 15 years ago, gosh, now it might be closer to 20 years ago, other former residents of Bougainville, now living in the US, sued that same mining company in federal court. And the plaintiffs went through that same process of giving their oral history, recounting their experiences, having those transcribed into declarations, and then ultimately articulated into the legal complaint. And the legal complaint, or the facts from that legal complaint, were then enshrined in or codified in some way in the Ninth Circuit's summary of the facts in their decision later. And I'll read the Ninth Circuit summary because I think it's remarkable that we can have a narrative like Clive's and then see how it is articulated ultimately in a US court. So the Ninth Circuit writes, Bougainville is an island in the South Pacific located just off the main island of Papua New Guinea. Rich in natural resources, including copper and gold, the island was targeted as a prime mining site by defendants Rio Tinto PLC, a British and Welsh corporation, and Rio Tinto Limited, an Australian corporation, collectively Rio Tinto. Rio Tinto is part of an international mining group that operates over 60 mines and processing plants in 40 countries, including the United States. To operate a mine on Bougainville, Rio Tinto required and received the assistance of the Papua New Guinean government. Beginning in the 1960s, Rio Tinto displaced villagers, razed massive tracts of rainforest, intensely polluted the land, rivers, and air with extensive collateral consequences, including fatal and chronic illness, death of wildlife and vegetation, and failure of farmland. And they systematically discriminated against its Bougainvillean workers who lived in slave-like conditions. It goes on to describe the ensuing conflict between the Bougainville residents and the company to stop the mining operations completely. And what ultimately happened was that the country descended, as the Ninth Circuit says, the country descended into a civil war after government troops slaughtered many Bougainvilleans in what has been known, or what has come to be known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Unable to resume mining, Rio Tinto threatened to abandon its operations and halt all future investments in Papua New Guinea unless the government took military action to secure the mine. And then in April 1990, the Papua New Guinean government imposed a military blockade on the island that lasted almost a decade. The blockade prevented medicine, clothing, and other necessities from reaching the residents. Under further pressure from Rio Tinto, according to the complaint, the government engaged in aerial bombardment of civilian targets, wanton killings and acts of cruelty, village burning, rape, and pillage. As a result, an estimated 15,000 Bougainvilleans, including many children, died. Of the survivors, tens of thousands are displaced and many suffer health problems. One of the articulations that stood out when the Ninth Circuit was talking about the effects of the mining operations, even before the country descended, or the island descended into war, was this phrase here. They said that separated by their roots, separated from the land and from its sources of sustenance, a deep sense of social malaise set in, which expressed itself in clan tensions, depression, alcohol abuse, rage, traffic accidents, and incidents of violence, all distress signals of people severed from their roots. I ran across this case when I was doing research on Rio Tinto for a different narrative altogether. We'd actually interviewed someone who was involved in negotiations with Rio Tinto in Boron, California. So not very far from here. And as we were talking to her and looking into Rio Tinto, we were doing some research, and that's when this case emerged. And so what had sort of started as an examination of a company that was, operating just a few hundred miles away in California, and a lockout that had happened just, I think the previous year, turned into sort of an exploration of the last 50 years of that mining company's operations in other parts of the world. And that was eye-opening for many reasons. It was eye-opening. But I think going back to that idea of how stories can affect social change, I think one way is how narratives can ultimately drive certain legal processes that are seeking justice in the courts. So I think that's one sort of bridge between stories and justice.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, reading your book just reminded me how important the stories and narratives are in general, specifically in bringing justice and legal action. And talking about the book that you mentioned, it reminded me of another book that I read about an Iranian refugee or asylum seeker. I think the book called No Friends But the Mountain by Behruz Buchani. And he's one of the people who seek to be a refugee in Australia, but Australian government shut down the program, so they put all of the asylums and refugees in the Christmas Island and Manu Island, and the book just brings a really, really interesting perspective on what went on while people were trapped in those islands and being just in the middle of, nowhere and just not knowing what is next. And at the end, like each of them talking, and Berhus Buchani was able to write his book on actually WhatsApp, which is like an app that you can communicate with other people. And and he wrote the whole book, and he actually won a lot of prizes, and he was finally resettled in New Zealand. So I think it's really brings a really, really perspective, especially to me, to look into how narratives and the stories are really important. So I wanted to ask another question, pretty much my last question. I was very inspired on now knowing how many of the activists were able to raise awareness internationally. For example, in the Bere Sanu Kingston story, and the Netherlands government gets involved, and many of the narration shows us that activism can bring change internally in the nation states. But how do you think the international arena should be involved to put pressure on this issue? What do you think is the best approach for us as just a general citizen to help in this process of activism?
Another great question. But I also have to say that is amazing that, that the book was written on WhatsApp. Will you tell me the name? Can you tell us the name again of that writer?
I actually have the book somewhere on my desk. I can find it later. Okay. But it's called
put it in the chat later.
Of course, yeah, No Friends But the Mountains, but I will put it.
That is just so fascinating. And WhatsApp, I use all the time to speak to relatives in Italy, and to speak to friends and colleagues in other parts of the world, in Mexico and Guatemala. I love to hear that an entire book was written on WhatsApp. That is such an interesting way to get it out there. And thank you for sharing too, Sahar, your own experience. We might get to this later in the Q&A, but I hope if you feel comfortable with it, I hope you'll tell us a little bit more about your journey from Iran to the United States. And I think you asked ultimately what we can do to sort of support some of the labor rights and human rights movements that are brought up in the book Invisible Hands, or just sort of in general. Is that the question? Yes, so there are a few things. I think that as citizens in the US, we can use first our voting power. There are bills that have come to the floor in, or at least been proposed in the last few years, that would demand more transparency in the supply chain, specifically demand transparency in relation or in regards to trafficking or forced labor that might be in any part of a supply chain. In fact, in the book, we actually go into the Supreme Court decision in Doe v. Nestle. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with that Supreme Court decision that came out last year, which was a case brought by former child slaves in cocoa plantations in the Ivory Coast. And the cocoa was ultimately winding up in chocolate products in the US. And the farmers were being subsidized by Nestle and some of the other Nestle, Cargill, and a couple of other corporations. And the former child slaves brought a lawsuit against Nestle and Cargill, seeking, both compensation and as sort of a remedy, a type of requirement for transparency in their supply chains, so that they would be, accountable or responsible if cocoa farmers in the future were using forced child labor in the production of cocoa. It's an interesting case. It kind of comes at the end of a long line of alien tort statute cases, one of which is also the case brought by the former residents of Bougainville, Saraivi Rio Tinto. We do talk a lot about that in the book, in both the first edition and in the second edition, kind of bringing things up to speed. But one way to sort of ensure that type of transparency without having to bring a case to the courts would be to urge your congressperson to support a bill called the Business Transparency Act, which was brought, I believe, in 2019. And, it's actually a pretty, in terms of what it requires of businesses, it's really just requiring them to show that they've made some effort to explore or to examine their supply chains and to then make the results public. So it's a small step forward. It might not be the end step, but it's one of the first steps. And then, there are some other bills that have been brought up that deal with some of the specific issues that are brought up in the book. One of them being the Children Don't Belong on Tobacco Farms Act, which I would say is sort of a direct outgrowth of the children like Neftali Cuello, who's a narrator in the book, speaking out about the hazards of working in the tobacco harvests without protective clothing, without any type of guidance about the health risks to children working in tobacco harvests. And so this proposed law, the Children Don't Belong on Tobacco Farms Act, responds to that issue in particular, and to those people who have stepped forward to really talk about it. And then, as consumers, there are some other things that I think we can do. You can use your purchasing power to sort of cast your vote in the marketplace. And there are a few organizations that I would probably recommend connecting with. One of them is the Fair Labor Organization. And they're an international organization that seeks to uphold workers' rights and has required that its member brands and retailers publicly disclose supply chain information. So it's an organization that's sort of recruiting companies that are willingly disclosing that information. And then there are a few others that I can put maybe in the chat as well, but maybe finally, I would quote Kalpona Actor again. She provided the foreword to the book, and I think it's a very eloquent foreword. She says, tell your own story and take time to listen to the workers that you encounter every day. For it is through story that we come to care, come to believe, and are ultimately transformed so that we can no longer be silent. So tell your story and listen to others.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited when your second edition is out, to read the book. I think it's a really amazing book, and it definitely did open my eyes in the power of storytelling and social justice. And I just, when I had the first edition, I just couldn't stop reading, because it was really interesting to see how all of the activists and narrators wanted to share their stories, even though when they were fearing retaliation. So thank you so much. It's great.
Thank you, Sahar.
So if any of you have questions, please put them in the chat box, or in the chat box. I don't really care. You can either send it to me or just put it in the general chat box. First of all, thank you, Professor Goria, and your interviewer, Sahar. It was I thought it was fascinating. And, from my perspective, you could go on for the rest of the night at least and tell us more and more stories. As you both know, I worked for USAID, the United States Agency for International Development. And as an example, when I was in Sierra Leone, which was for 6 years, we had my boss, who was over in Guinea, had brought in Rio Tinto to be working more at that point, more in Guinea. I think it was mining in that case. I in Sierra Leone, we were working more in the diamond industry and trying to bring the agriculture sector back after the 11-year civil war with Sierra Leone and Liberia. So we didn't have a Rio Tinto initiative on board with us. USAID was trying to partner with a lot of these corporations from the development perspective of, will you, Rio Tinto, or will you, Nestle, come into these countries and not just exploit, not just make your profit off of their backs, literally, but what will you bring to the table? And our role, USAID's role, was to try to facilitate that negotiation and kind of oversee the process to at least hopefully begin the process of less exploitation and more consideration for the kinds of issues you're talking about, labor and so forth. So, for example, I was working a lot in the diamond sector in Sierra Leone, and it was to, sort of counter conflict diamonds. I was real interested, and I did follow that Nestle story for me, I thought it was in Ghana. It could well have been, Ivory Coast as well, because the, cocoa is grown in that whole region. And my understanding is there was a finite life, I forget what it is, 15 years or 20 years for the chocolate, for the plants. And so Nestle was really aggressively trying to, extract as much of the cocoa as quickly as possible, because those trees were reducing their yield. And I guess they get completely ripped out and you have to start all over again. So it's hard to stay ahead of that curve. So I have a couple of questions. One, in a way, the most important to me, I think, in a certain way, is the use of the stories that you gathered and the lessons learned and the book itself. Are you just telling the stories to readers that are interested, or are you also, and if it's, Voice of Witness, maybe you could tell us a little bit about Voice of Witness, what they do. But I think my real point is, where does this rubber meet the road? You gave a couple of examples where these stories led to legislation. How prevalent is that? Who, I think in one of the examples, I was curious, let me see which one, it doesn't really matter which one. One of the examples you gave, I was like, who's behind it? Which the last story you just told, where, what was it, the trafficking? Oh, right. So it was Nestle's, for example. So you were saying that this, the former child slave workers, sort of brought their stories and brought this case. Mm-hmm. But I lived there. I was Peace Corps in West Africa too. So who was behind that? Who sort of either went out to, was it the Western people like you, was it a Western vision to go get these stories, and through gathering these stories, identifying activists within the country, and then, how does it move all the way up from that child soldier, many of whom are not very well educated, to making it into law and actually transforming maybe a sector?
Yeah, so I can speak a little bit to that. The narratives that we gathered were not from active plaintiffs or plaintiffs of active cases. So even though we did speak to Barry Suwanu Kingston, for example, who is of the Ogoni tribe in Nigeria, and who had spent much of his youth as an activist trying to raise awareness about the pollution that that oil extraction was causing in Ogoni land. And then he ultimately was, persecuted by the Nigerian government. He was almost executed. He fled to Benin. He ultimately went to the United States, and he obtained asylum in the US. We got to sit down and talk with him. His case did not make it to the Supreme Court, but Esther Kiobel's case, and that name might ring a bell, Kiobel v. Royal Dutch Shell, her case did make it to the US Supreme Court, and she was the wife of another activist who was executed in Nigeria, who was an Ogoni activist in Nigeria. And so just to sort of make the distinction, we did not interview, the individual plaintiffs in either the Rio Tinto case or the Dovey Nestle case or the Kiobel case. But I could also speak a tiny bit to how those plaintiffs may ultimately arrive in the U.S. courts. Actually, Professor Lance Kompa, who's a friend, he has worked for many years as a professor at Cornell in the international labor law field. And he has been instrumental in cases himself. And oftentimes it is a collaboration between individuals in that country who are working for change in that country, or who have themselves sort of escaped from harrowing circumstances in that country, working in collaboration with lawyers in another country, who oftentimes take the case on pro bono. So in the Sarai v. Rio Tinto case, they worked with a law firm, I believe, based in Oregon. In the Dovey Nestle case, I believe that was a collection of attorneys who were working pro bono along with the International Labor Rights Forum that was providing some legal counsel. So there is that, I think, collaboration between the two. And in one sort of interesting alien tort statute case, which is this, the law that sort of ties all those cases together, an organization was formed specifically to help plaintiffs bring their case into U.S. courts. And this was the Unical case, a couple of decades ago. There were plaintiffs from, Myanmar who had been affected by the building of a pipeline in collaboration with Burmese, militant groups or with the Burmese military at the time. And so an organization basically formed in the United States to lead the legal counsel for that case. So I think that you're right. There is a sort of bridge or collaboration happening oftentimes with a nonprofit organization that's interested in those issues to begin with, and then kind of spearheading a legal action.
So in that regard, do you see your book as, more importantly than the book, the lessons learned, the stories and the lessons learned, do you see that having an important role in educating other countries where these kinds of abuses occur and are probably not challenged as much? Say for example, again, back to a West African example, that do you get these books out to maybe it's NGOs, maybe it's some of the universities, not to mention the governments of a lot of countries. So do you do that at all? Do you have that in mind? Do you think it's useful so that the book is not just, for an American audience, yeah, these are fascinating stories and, oh, I can't believe that happened. And I'm so glad, it went to court and the situation was remedied. But even that those stories and the lessons learned educate other people who maybe don't put all those pieces together, don't have access to all that information, to be able to look at that story and go, wow, that's really similar to our situation. So I didn't know that we could, or that we should have an opportunity to really change things, so that your book would really be a change-making tool, not just amazing stories of great heroism.
Yeah, I do think that there's sort of an exchange or a dialogue happening between the book and the readers. And one example might be that the book was translated into Korean, and so it was distributed in South Korea. And one of the biggest victories that's come in the last few years came from Han Hae-kyung, the narrator from South Korea, who fought for over 10 years to get Samsung to recognize that her very rare cancer, along with the very rare cancers of other very young workers, were related to a hazardous facility that Samsung had been running. And she and these other workers, along with their doctor, who had been studying the cancer cluster for quite some time, they ultimately won Samsung's public apology and a public recognition that, in fact, after a decade of denying any connection whatsoever between their illnesses and the facility that these workers had worked in, they stepped forward and publicly acknowledged that there was a connection. They issued an apology, and they have set up a compensation fund for them. When I first interviewed Han Hae-kyung, none of that progress had been made. They had been continuously rejected by the South Korean Workers' Compensation Agency, saying that there was no proof that there was any connection. And then finally, some documents got leaked from Samsung itself about the health of the workers from that facility. And those helped their case. And then Han Hae-kyung and 1,000 others formed a chain around Samsung. And they actually slept out in front of the Samsung headquarters for almost 3 years. And after sort of the culmination of that demonstration and that protest is when Samsung came forward and said, we're ready to negotiate. We want to talk about this. And then, those other steps sort of fell in line. I wouldn't claim that the translation of Invisible Hands helped with any of that. But at the same time, I think it is heartening, and it is heartening for the various activists to see, what others are doing in different industries. And in some ways, it reads a bit like a guidebook for activism, because you see so many different approaches to changing the industry and to changing circumstances and conditions in those industries.
I was a democracy officer with a lot of focus on NGOs and civil society. And so that's exactly, my thought process. Also, it sounds like from your book, have you thought about it, or has somebody else already done something like that? Has anybody made a documentary? I mean, if there was a documentary of, maybe 10 of the most compelling stories that would cover, in theory, most of the significant sectors where these abuses occur all around the world. It seems to me it's something like an IRC that focuses, on the refugee stories. So something like that, where you'd have documentaries that would show these stories. What are the issues, and how does this movement grow, and what worked maybe and what didn't work, and that actually becomes a documentary that could go to NGOs around the world who are struggling kind of on their own. And this shows, oh, guess what? The whole world is paying attention to these kinds of things. And like I say, so many different sectors and different issues around the world. So have you thought about that? Do you know if something like that already exists?
I am not a documentarian myself. I know in the first collection of oral histories, the Underground America documentarian actually worked on that collection, and she she was sort of interested in trying to turn the collection of oral histories into a documentary. And I've had people suggest that about Invisible Hands. I don't feel like that's my wheelhouse. And so I think it would be wonderful to have it come alive in documentary form. But I don't think I would be the right person to do that. But I'm open to suggestions, definitely. If you know anybody, send them my way, or you can send me to them.
That'll be a separate conversation, but maybe so. I have one more question, and actually I'll take this other question, and I've got one more question. But do you know whether either Foxconn workers or any other narrator has suffered consequences? How would you feel if any had? Would it affect your determination to pursue more narratives, or at least influence your choice of who to interview? Really good questions.
Yeah. As to my knowledge, no, none of the narrators that we interviewed for this book have or did suffer any, retaliation for sharing their stories with us directly. And, as to whether that would affect our trying to sort of cultivate stories, I think that the narratives that we have are a result of, both the publisher, the organization Voice of Witness, and myself being interested in speaking with individuals in the industry and who are trying to change things in their industry. And also on the other side, their interest in wanting to amplify what's happening in their industry and what they've been through. And so it already, was a collaboration. I would say most of the individuals who gave their interviews had already decided in some way that they wanted to become active in changing things in their industry. So, we ended up talking to the people who wanted to talk to us. If someone did suffer repercussions as a result of speaking with us, that would certainly affect, I'm sure, how I would proceed in the future, just as, a person. Of course, I would be affected by that. Whether that, should shut down the conversation altogether might be, more of the philosophical question. But personally, sure, I'm sure it would affect me.
Right. Same with USAID and working a lot of times with opposition, so more the political sphere, but working with the opposition. There was an example in a country where I worked where when the opposition, they were like directly competing for the presidency. So the president, of course, wasn't happy about that. The opposition oftentimes was badly beaten when they would attend any kind of training or meeting or anything like that. And, even back in Washington, then there was a debate about what the USG position should be with respect to, do we continue to provide training and opportunities for dialogue for the people who are asking for it? And they know that, and they know that they're going to, get beaten. So is that our responsibility if they get beaten and so we don't do the training, or do we do the training because they want it, they're asking for us to give it to them, and they're willing to take the consequences? In that particular example, the decision was made that we would provide the training to the people who really wanted it. They had no other way to bring change to their country, and they knew that it was dangerous. And they're like, but we'd rather be educated and do what we want to do with the right tricks of the trade. And I'm not talking about arms, because this is USAID, so I'm not talking about military things. So you're right. Sometimes there are so many brave, as Sahar mentioned, there's so many brave people in the world that are taking great risks. And of course that almost, is a perfect segue over to Ukraine for a few moments, where we can see right now the bravery of the Ukrainian people. So we talked in the beginning about the possibility that you two would mention Ukraine, and then I believe, Sahar, did you also, for Professor Goria, you were going to make some comments about your own journey from Iran to the United States. Were you comfortable with that?
Yes, of course. I don't know if you want to do Ukraine first or me first, however you prefer. But
why don't we let, I don't know if you're both talking about Ukraine, why don't we do Ukraine just because that kind of segued, and then when we finish that, we'll turn it over to you. Okay.
Sure, and I didn't have much to say because that's also, I would say, out of my wheelhouse, except for how it dovetails with immigration and asylum law. And I think that's interesting. And also, you know, maybe how it dovetails with the idea of stories and the power of stories, especially in the legal sphere. I thought it was really interesting that Ukraine brought suit against Russia in the International Court of Justice within a week of their invasion. And it was, you know, for Russia sort of manipulating the Genocide Convention to say that Ukraine had been committing genocide against its own people. And, you know, they were really calling on the ICJ to give its authority, you know, some sort of moral and legal authority to Ukraine and to condemn the invasion. And they did, you know, the ICJ did. I think, you know, some might argue that this shows the limits of international law, which is that there aren't really many enforcement mechanisms. Even if the ICJ is condemning the invasion, what are they really going to do? Has it prevented Russia from, you know, any type of action in Ukraine? And some would argue no. But I think you could also argue that it shows sort of the power of international law in that it hasn't been completely ignored, and Ukraine does seek that, or did seek that, you know, moral and legal authority to bolster its side and to bolster, you know, international opinion as to what was going on. And, you know, at the same time, the International Criminal Court also opened investigations into war crimes in Ukraine, which I think is another example of how just the act of recording stories, of making a record of what's happening by way of taking testimony from people on the ground, by way of doing investigations on the ground, can ultimately be used for justice. And, you know, again, people might argue that the ICC opening an investigation isn't helping anyone right now. It's not having any immediate effect, but at the same time, it's making a record to hold, you know, those individuals accountable later. It's basically saying that those events are not going to be ignored. Those actions are not going to be ignored. So I think, you know, on the one hand, Ukraine and the sort of international law aspects are an illustration of how stories are important in justice. And then kind of switching over to refugee and asylum law, I mean, that's, there's a lot to be said. I was actually just listening to the head of the IRC the other day. I'm not sure if others listened to that interview with NPR. You know, the head of the IRC was sort of explaining that Europe had extended these great benefits to Ukrainian refugees, you know, basically a 3-year residence, 3 years of public services, including education, 3-year work permit, all, you know, immediately extended to Ukrainian refugees. And he was saying, that's excellent. That's wonderful news. At the same time, does it show this, you know, sort of hypocrisy in that Europe, which normally espouses these principles of sort of universal equality, is extending these very real benefits to just one group of refugees from just one country? and to the exclusion of so many others, you know, in particular, Syrian refugees and Afghan refugees, Syrian refugees who've now, you know, been in refugee camps, some of them for over a decade. So I thought that was interesting. And I wasn't sure what was happening right now with the US. And I know, Sahar, you work for the IRC. Maybe you could speak a little bit to what the US is doing, what the IRC in San Diego is doing right now.
Of course. So I'm just gonna speak a little bit generally about all the refugees, specifically with Afghan refugees. I know for Ukrainian refugees, it's like a different, as it's been introduced by the government, it's kind of like different program. They require sponsors, and you know, people are gonna be sponsoring. So they're not technically gonna be, they're not going to be, I believe, so a lot of resettlement agencies being involved, since the sponsors are going to be involved. And on the other side, we're also talking about Asylum, which is also another different program, because our program, the resettlement program, specifically works with refugees or humanitarian parolees. But I mean, just speaking generally from my own experience with refugees from different backgrounds, and specifically with the Afghan refugees that and the emergency evacuation that happened in Afghanistan, I would say at the beginning, it was really no plan on what was happening and what was the next step for us, as far as like communication and how would, you know, how can we help and what is going to happen. It just literally happened. To me, it felt like overnight, but I mean, it was happening in days, but it was just all of a sudden we were aware that we were resettling many families on a very short notice. To the point that, you know, like every day I would open my email and be like, oh, like there are 10 families added to a list of travel that are coming this week or next week. So in the beginning, of course, we faced many challenges. Like the San Diego County didn't know that humanitarian parolees were eligible for welfare, food stamp, cash assistance. So it took a month just explaining to every caseworker in the San Diego County that they are eligible. Look at this letter, you know, like government said it, this is the policy, this, that. But it definitely took some time. And on the other hand, San Diego is going through a really bad housing shortage, and the rent just is going crazy. And I mean, also, like another challenge we had was with social security officers. Like every social security appointment we had to like bring a lot of paperwork just to show them that they are eligible to get social security. And you know, if you don't have social security, you technically cannot start to have anything or start a job or anything in the US specifically. So it took time, but as the time passed, I would say things got a little bit bigger, specifically around the area of the housing shortage and the rental assistance. We had a lot of families that were resettled. They found apartments, but they couldn't afford the third month rent or fourth month rent. So of course, the government introduced recently like some programs that is specifically helping Afghan refugees, not the other refugees from other countries. They are paying their rents for a few months in advance. There are loan programs. So there are a lot of good programs being introduced after us bringing up all of these issues and what we're facing every day. And on another hand, I would say one of our major issue at the moment, specifically with refugee families, is the housing. As you know, the government in the US doesn't provide housing to refugees. So when somebody comes here, specifically in California, of course, landlords are requiring, you know, rental history, credit history, like 3 times the rent. They need to show an income. They don't have that. And IRC and all of the resettlement agencies cannot sign as a co-signer. So that's another challenge. So technically, any landlords that we find that wants to help us, it's just doing it out of the kind heart. like there's no other way for them to, rent with all of the eligibilities and requirements that they have. So I hope in the future we will have that addressed by the government, or some solution or resolution to this chaos, because we are facing we have families in hotels for months, and that's just, I think it's not fair for somebody who is excited to come here and wants to resettle, wants to, get to know how can they leave and everything. So yeah, that's a little bit of my perspective.
So I really appreciate what you just said, because that's really a major place where my heart is right now. I've just spoken with IRC this week and the 3 other major refugee resettlement organizations in San Diego, the Jewish Family Services and Catholic Charities and Alliance for African Assistance. And I'm hoping to get their messages and start sharing those with the San Diego World Affairs Council, because we don't have to change the whole world, and maybe we can't, but we're directly impacted in our community. It's not just an intellectual exercise. We've got the refugees at our borders, and they're coming in and to our communities, and they're going to be living in our communities. So I feel like the more that everybody, that San Diego community is aware of what's going on and what the very serious problems are that you just articulated so well. I mean, I hope that a community like the San Diego World Affairs Council would be open to taking that issue seriously and putting some action behind it. It's one thing to say, gee, that's too bad, I wish I could do something, I can't. Well, here's an opportunity. Yes, actually you can. We've got 4, and there are probably more, but I understand there are 4 major organizations that have the challenges that you just outlined. And a lot of those challenges, I think, could be reduced, if not mitigated, reduced by a lot of the population. There's a lot of, as we all know, a lot of economic disparity in San Diego County. There are people that have plenty of money, and there are people that don't. And of course, housing is, very, very, it's a gigantic issue, and jobs and so forth. So that's a perfect segue for where I hope, that we'll be moving as we go forward. We've just started that discussion in our newsletter, our monthly newsletter. And I'm hoping maybe to even have the organizations make presentations to the World Affairs Council. And the annual meeting, I'm also hoping that, that those organizations might be interested in joining us, so that our members have an opportunity to talk sort of one-on-one and hear for themselves what the stories are, and whatever questions or concerns they may individually have, they have a chance to, have it answered by the legitimate sources that are dealing with the challenges. So is there anything else you wanted to say about your own experience from Iran?
I would say a few words, just a few sentences. So I was born and raised in Iran, and just living in Iran, I definitely did witness firsthand many human rights violations, specifically as a woman. Which makes me really grateful for all of the freedom that I have been given in the United States. I really do appreciate, the liberty to just be able to speak right now. As even today, when I was reading the news about Iran, people were just protesting against the, why the groceries or bread or like chicken and stuff like that has, the prices has gone up really bad. People cannot afford food anymore. And I just saw that the government actually shot 5 or 6 protesters. I'm not sure how many, but there were a few people killed in the street. So broke my heart being away from my country. But in 2015, I came to the United States with my parents, and we applied for asylum a few months after being in the US. But my parents and I are Christians, and just being interested in another religion. But we were just fearing, the death punishment, which in Iran, for converting from Islam to another religion, or even just expressing an interest in another religion, the punishment is technically death if you're catch. but also we were facing other political threats, and we just decided to apply for asylum, fearing for our life, just to go back to Iran. I mean, just personal experience, it was really hard for me to see my parents start technically from zero and see them struggle to leave all of their loved ones. We don't have anybody here, loved ones in Iran, and build, and the life that they had built for 40 years in Iran. And they're are still waiting for their asylum interview, and it's been about 7 years. USCIS is really backed up, so it's been taking a long time for a lot of asylum seekers to get their interviews. However, I would say with all of the bitter and sweetness, we are all feel very lucky and grateful to be given a chance to live and build our life here freely. And specifically me, I went to university, I graduated, and I got the urge to just be involved in immigration and refugees and just give back and share my experience with other families. So it's been great. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you for sharing. It's a lovely way to end, because we're ending with a story, the whole point of the power of the story. So your story is as important as these other stories. And, you're one individual telling your story, but we all know how many people back in your case, how many people back in Iran, want to have that story to tell, then, and we're lucky and we're blessed here in the United States that, that we're here in the United States, and that we have the many blessings we have with all the imperfections, and that we do have the doors that are open, and that we do hopefully welcome people like you to enrich us and to help us have these discussions now. And, now that you're working with IRC, I'm sure having someone who's gone through the experience helps, even if there's a language barrier and it's different, it's representatives from other countries that are coming in. I'm sure that there's such a strong bond with what you just talked about, what you have to leave behind, the sacrifices, the fear, the threats possibly, and then starting all over. My mother's family did exactly the same thing. Wealthy in Europe and left with nothing, and started at the very bottom, and they were doctors and everything, started at the very bottom to have to rebuild an entire life. But it's back to the stories. If we have those stories, they make us wiser, they make us stronger. Ideally, in my opinion, they make us more compassionate. And in that way, I hope that we make a better world. Your lesson, my lesson, again, from my own mother's experience, is to be welcoming and to be compassionate and to be grateful for what we have. And if we were born here, we were damn lucky. It's the luck of the draw. And we were lucky that we started with this. So if we can help others, it's my opinion that we have that responsibility, we have that blessing to do it. So Professor Goria, did you want to have any last words?
That was so well said. Thank you, Christine. No, I think that was very well said. The power of the story, and also the power of being in a position to help others. Thank you so much for having us tonight. And thank you everybody who is here. It was really a pleasure and an honor to be able to talk a little bit about storytelling and social justice in general, and be able to talk with the San Diego World Affairs Council.
Thank you for your book. And thank you for teaching both the storytelling and the political science. Thank you for being an immigration lawyer. So thank you for the richness that you've created in your being, in your life, and the way in which you're giving back, as Sahar also is finding her ways to give back. So God is shining the light down on you both. Thank you.